Okay, it is now 11:20, and so this hearing is resumed. Just before moving on, I am reminded that I promised prior to starting the hearing today that due to issues with attendance that I would allow the York Travellers Trust to exercise their rights to be heard. Is that to you, Mr. Pittam?
Yes, it is. I'm very sorry, sir, that I do need to leave at 12 o'clock.
And please do fire away.
Oh, right. Thank you very much. So our point is really under the exceptions, I think, part of the discussion that we would want to make. And basically, the point that we would like to make is a simple one, that we are concerned that the proposed green belt boundary will be set too tight and will be unsound because it will not allow for the gypsy and traveller needs to be met. And Gypsies and Travellers are York's oldest minority community and one of its largest minority communities. We also have concerns about the Council's needs assessment and the floor, and we think that policy H5 is also of concern to us, but those are matters that we want to deal with obviously later. But what we're really clear is that there's a very, very real need for accommodation for the Gypsy and Traveller community. And this raises profound equality issues because we know that Gypsies and the Travellers are amongst the most disadvantaged ethnic minorities in this country by a range of indicators. And we have provided evidence for this, which has been provided by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who have been supporting us in thinking about our work on the local plan. And we think that a plan that does not meet the needs of the Gypsy and Traveller community is likely to be contrary to the public sector equality duty and indirectly discriminatory, contrary to Section 19 of the 2010 Equality Act.
If it might help, Mr. Pittam, for you to know that in phase 2 of these hearings, issues relating to Gypsies and Travellers is something that we will be looking at separately in detail. Yes. So for today, I'd ask you to focus entirely on the any green belt matters that you say relates to that. But that as I say, we will be looking at the needs, etc., in great detail under phase 2.
Fine, yes, and I do appreciate that, sir, and we will be wanting to make representations there. But our primary concern then in terms of the green belt is that if the Council's plans that are being proposed, that the site allocations is done through the big development sites, but the Council's proposed policy is also to allow developers to actually offer alternative sites or to actually pay money for it. If the green belt is set too tightly, some of those proposed other sites that any developers might have, and we are aware that 1 or 2 developers have already approached us and talked about that, but that land is likely to be in the green belt. And we know that government policy does not allow for traveller sites to be built in the green belt once the green belt has been set. So our real concern is that there is nothing in this plan as it currently is created that actually makes the provision for the needs, and the needs we think are greater than what the Council has suggested, to be brought forward. So there is the concern for us is that if the green belt boundary, the inner boundary, is set in such a way that and there are no identified sites and that the developers actually opt for the process which they've been offered through the council of either offering alternative sites, which would have to be in the non-green belt land, but we think that would be very problematic, or if they pay the money, which we know several have already suggested that they may want to do, if the green belt is set without making any recognition of that point, then there is a real problem in terms of the needs of this minority community. Thank you.
Sir, thank you. I think this is really a stage 2 issue, sir, for reasons I can explain. It's clear from a look at the policy provision in the plan that the council has assessed the needs for gypsy and traveller needs, both for gypsies and travellers that meet the recently changed definition, and for those who do not meet the definition, but whose needs have been taken into account to ensure the provision of what's been described as culturally suitable accommodation. It's not a particularly attractive term, but the concept is understood. That has involved an assessment which showed that there is a need for 2 permanent pitches for gypsies and travellers that meet the definition, along with 1 more to deal with unknown need for gypsies and travellers within the definition. It also revealed a need for 33 pitches to address known need for gypsy and travellers who didn't meet the definition, and 11 additional pitches for unknown need.
Okay, I don't want to dwell on the detail because that will certainly be for phase 2.
The reason I mention it, sir, is to tee up the proposition that we do not think that we need to look at green belt boundaries to address the points that have been raised, because the needs that have been set out in through allocated sites, first of all, make provision not just for the known need, but for the unknown need. And if there is a concern about unknown needs coming forward, which are not accommodated at any stage within strategic sites, then we're prepared to look at H5 to ensure that exceptions could be made where provision hasn't satisfactorily, GB4, sorry, where policy GB4, where provision hasn't adequately being achieved on strategic sites. And that would essentially allow further gypsy and traveller sites to be treated under the exceptions policy. We're also prepared to look at whether policy H5, which requires provision to be made within the strategic sites, can be tightened in some way so that developers of strategic sites, rather than simply offering an alternative site, need to demonstrate it's not viable to do it within the strategic one. So we just raise those as illustrations of points that show that these points can really be addressed as part of the stage 2 policies, rather than at this stage saying you need to amend your green belt boundaries to facilitate that need.
So what I take from that is the council thinks that the need will be met through the plan as submitted, but if there is a concern on our part in that regard, then it may well be that the council puts forward modifications to policy, including the policy relating to rural exceptions, to ensure that the need is met. And you're putting that down now as a marker for further scrutiny under phase 2.
Yes, sir. We say that the strategic allocations have been Policy H5 relating to provision on the strategic allocations has been drafted to meet the need. But insofar as there may be any concerns about need raised at stage 2, amendments could be made to the policies at stage 2 to address that without looking at green belt boundaries. Yes.
Anything else from your viewpoint, Mr. Pittam?
Well, two points. One is that we question the numbers quite significantly and that we will want to go into that in stage 2. But I think the second thing is that what we're conscious of is that we're coming into this local plan with absolutely no sites identified whatsoever. And that is the real problem that we face. And if the green belt boundary is created in such a way, we know very well that government policy will not allow the development of further gypsy and traveller sites within the green belt. So we think that the policy, you know, the whole plan is at the moment unsound on that base, and there's a real equality issue that needs to be addressed.
We're quite prepared to have that debate on the approach that's been taken to needs, but it's really, we say, a stage 2 debate which can be covered by any amendments to policies at stage 2.
Yeah,
I wish I could be so confident that this can be dealt with in that way.
For my part, it's certainly something that we will be looking at, as I say, in a lot of detail, as you would expect. We will be seeking to ensure that the plan is consistent with national policy in relation to this matter as others. Okay, thank you. Then I will return to question, yes, we're still on the first question of the day, to question 3.1, and I'm going to insist that people stay strictly within the parameters of this question. So far, yeah, fuzzy edges seems to be a theme of the day, and the edges of question 3.1 have certainly been stretched over into question 3.2. I'm going to insist that people stay strictly to 3.1 now so that progress can be made. Mr. Wright.
So I'm not quite sure where your boundary is, but because all I wanted to do was just make some quick points.
I'm afraid I don't have a map showing.
Right. Some quick points in reply to what was said, and it will only take me a couple of minutes at most. You were asked about the value of PPG2 in the process, and my submission on that is that it is useful evidence and can be regarded in that light. Mr. Nattrass raised an issue that the historical matters that I refer to, we didn't have the plans and so forth before as well. We do. It's all in my original response, and that's as much before this inquiry as is the plan itself. Catherine Dukes gave us her recollections as an author of the RSS policy. As we discussed last week, that's not appropriate to interpretation of the policy at all, and that was agreed by Mr. Elvin in clear terms. The policy anyway is not that of the RSS in 2008, it is the policy of the Secretary of State in the Revocation Order of 2013. Because it was, in relation to Mr. Tucker's point about the relativity of the policy to the MPPF, it postdates the MPPF, does the policy in 2013. You asked me to believe that this, you are asked to believe that this green belt was defined based on evidence after 2013, and that it provides the same result as a non-evidence-based plan in 1991. Such a coincidence, in my view, is not credible. The Secretary of State's view was referred to in call-in inquiries. I recognise faces around the table of people who've appeared at call-in inquiries, but I think that I have appeared in significantly more than anybody else. And the Secretary of State's point about the Greenbelt boundaries in the call-in inquiries was that he didn't want to do anything that would prejudice the eventual determination of the boundaries. And so he took a fairly strict view of where what was Greenbelt and not Greenbelt. But I don't think it helps you in any way at all. He was just ensuring that we didn't get any premature decisions that scuppered the thing being done properly. Unfortunately, the thing hasn't been done properly. And then finally, with regard to a plan, there was some mention at the end. I think I've actually supplied you with one, but there is something in there for you to look at.
On 3.1, Mr. Wright, is that everything that you'd hoped and dreamed you'd be able to say at this hearing about it? Because I won't come back.
Sorry, sir.
Is there anything else on 3.1? Because I won't be coming back.
Not at all. In fact, I don't intend to say anything to 3.2 now. I think I've said what I needed to say. Otherwise, it's covered in my hearing statement.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Wright. Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, sir. I was just picking up this point of the inner boundary and where that is. I don't think it's clear-cut, and it might be a point that you were alluding to in your request for a map of what's the general extent and what's not the general extent, but where that inner boundary goes, because York's quite an interchangeable definition of to where it extends, and it's not clear to me whether the RSS policy also refers to the villages that run along the edge of the ring road, especially given the role in the evidence that the land adjacent to the green belt, to those villages, seems to have in safeguarding the special character and setting and historicals of the historic city. I know I can't see any definition in the RSS as to what York is. I know in the past the villages have met quite a lot of York's housing need.
Mr. Wedgwood.
Yeah, as far as the RSS goes, with a boundary, an outer boundary at about 6 miles, and then an indicative boundary about inside. I think this fuzzy edges thing is, I don't think that boundary, I don't think it's open to actually say that there is any boundary there within the RSS, because it would conflict with the actual policy of the RSS, which says the boundary has to be defined through the local plan process. So I think the starting position has to be that all of the land inside the outer boundary is considered within the general extent of the Greenbelt, and that's been the policy in the RSS, which has been adopted since 2009, I think, so for the last 11 years or so. And within that time, had anybody challenged that, it's been the legal position, and it was saved particularly in 2013 to protect the legal protection of the Greenbelt. Had anyone challenged that, nobody would have really been able to know what was in and what was out as regards the inner boundary. So the only real sensible position is to say that every scrap of land inside the outer boundary is considered in for the starting point. And I believe that was the position that the inspector took in one of the called-in applications. I think it might have been Avon Drive. Thank you.
Mr. Johnston.
Thank you, sir. I'll be brief. Our position is fairly clear on this. Our statement is that our position is that the green belts have been set for the first time, and therefore exceptional circumstances aren't required. Just to expand on some of the points raised this morning, you referred to paragraph 85 and which sets out what local authorities should do when they're defining green belts. Mr. Coe made a very good point around the requirement for consistency of the local plan strategy for meeting identified sustainable development needs. Then there are 6 other limbs to that as well. They're all of equal weight, and from my reading of it, there are exercises that need to be undertaken in parallel at the same time when defining the green belt for the first time. Listening to the council's response this morning on the approach they've taken, and reading the evidence base, it's clear that there's an inconsistent approach that's been taken to this. In some cases, there's an assessment of the value of the green belt before first then assessing what the development needs are. Our client is one of those which is not on the inner or outer boundary, so they are in the middle. But from a consistency position and from a justification position, I think there's a requirement for the council to look at this holistically. The NPPF refers to defining boundaries. It doesn't actually, in the truest sense, in the widest sense, all boundaries. So I think it's incumbent on the council to be looking at across the green belt. And it may be fair to say that when you're looking within the areas outside of the inner and the outer boundaries, it may be a quicker task, or maybe be able to on a larger scale, but the absence of that evidence is a missing piece in this whole process. I think in terms of consistency with local plan strategy, I think there's a question on that later on, so I'll save the points till then.
Grateful, thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. I haven't spoken on the matter, but I'll be relatively brief, but I've got a number of points if you don't mind me making them. Firstly, on the point about the fuzzy boundaries plan, I think very briefly you can look at the figure 7, which is in the Greenbelt addendum paper and TP1, because that is essentially the Greenbelt fuzzy boundaries plan. I'm not a supporter necessarily of that as a document, but it gives you a good indication as to where the council will go if it was asked to draw a plan now. On the point about the inner boundaries, I'm broadly in agreement with Mr. Napkis and slightly in disagreement with Mr. Tucker on the basis that if you took a salmon-coloured pen and drew the inner ring road, or the outer ring road as you would call it, you would broadly come up with that same dotted line. So in my view, is that land inside the ring road is very much a question as to whether or not it's new greenbelt or not. And on that particular point, on policy YH9C, the council have taken a slightly different approach to what I think is what's advocated in the RSS under that policy YH9C. And this was a matter raised by Catherine Dukes. If you go to that particular policy, it sets one clear step, is that you establish your growth requirements at the same time as that you're setting the greenbelt boundary to preserve your historic setting. So what you don't do is that you don't take a precautionary approach by making it all greenbelt first and then setting the development areas. You actually do it at the same time, because in that RSS, it required a housing requirement for York of 850 dwellings per annum. So in setting the inner boundary in the RSS policy, it's a one-step process, not a two-step process. And step one is very clear, is that you're establishing at the very same time as setting your boundaries, your development areas. And I'm very pleased in that respect that the council have rowed back a little bit with respect to ST8 and recognised the fact that ST8 in itself, and I'm not going into the detail of that, probably is one of those areas where you're not necessarily having to identify the exceptional circumstances. The point about the precautionary approach, you won't find the precautionary approach in the NPPF. I think what you'll find in the NPPF is the significantly boosting the housing land supply approach. So I'm not necessarily in agreement with the council's two-stage on that. And as referenced by Mr. Corsia about the Secretary of State decisions, as referenced just by Mr. Wright there, is that the Secretary of State in Section 73 appeals systems, is that they would take a precautionary approach because there was no greenbelt boundary for them to work with. And I think in this case, we're not needing to follow the Secretary of State's position in that case. If, and this is strained very slightly into 3.2, if the council were to take a precautionary approach as advised under the policy in the RSS, I think you need to look no further than figure 3.1 of the actual document itself of this local plan, because 3.1 shows you the historic character and setting of York areas inside the ring road. And therefore, the starting point for the precautionary approach would be to make those areas green belt, but that doesn't include all of the land inside the ring road itself. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. We've heard a bit today about the white land within the Outer Ring Road. I think it's just worth dwelling on what policy Y1 of the RSS says. It actually says, in the City of York LDF, define the detailed boundaries of the outstanding sections of the outer boundary of the York Green Belt, about 6 miles from the city centre, and the inner boundaries in line with the policy. To my mind, that is a broad band of green belt 6 miles from the city centre, including all that inner area. And that can only be right, sir, because at that point, the bodies assessing the special character of York hadn't determined what those key areas were within that inner boundary that were important for the setting of York. So the general extent of the green belt, and I agree with Mr. Tucker's view here, is that you don't have to demonstrate very special circumstances, but it's my view that all of that area is actually within that general extent. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Natkus.
Sorry, so you may not have seen Mrs. Hubbard's got her nameplate up. I thought I'd defer to her.
I didn't. Thank you for that. Mrs. Hubbard.
Yes, thank you. Just to endorse what Mr. Johnson said about the land on the edge of the urban area, I don't think the call-in decisions over the years can help you. I've done a fair few appeals on the edge of York over quite a lot of years, where the decisions have been made by inspectors, very senior inspectors, known to a few of us here, have taken the view that land can't be treated as being in the green belt on the periphery of York until it's positively put in an adopted plan. The Secretary of State has taken a precautionary approach, as Mr. Johnson says, and the phrase that has come out in numerous decisions over many, many years on call-in cases is the Secretary of State, different to Secretary of States over the years, of course, have said phrases like, until the detailed boundaries are defined in an adopted local plan, I see no reason why the land should not be treated as if it were green belt. And that's a very different state of affairs from saying it is green belt and should be treated as such. Thank you.
Mr. Natkus.
Thank you. There's two themes that have come forward as I've listened this morning. First of all, in terms of the inner boundary, we've been told that we are setting it for the first time and it's slightly different to the outer boundary in the area beyond the ring road. And we've been told that a precautionary approach is going to be applied, and that's where the exceptional circumstances come from. And as Mr. Johnson says, there isn't a test for a precautionary approach. You know, it's either we need exceptional circumstances or we don't. We can't do something just because it's a preference. That wouldn't be sound because it wouldn't be compliant with national policy. Going out then, let's say beyond the ring road, the general view was that exceptional circumstances are not required. However, with the disclaimer that they might be on the bigger sites and maybe we should apply them to the bigger sites. But again, we can't pick and choose. ST15 was mentioned, but also my client site at ST14 was referenced to say, well, actually, that one probably would need to show exceptional circumstances, but others wouldn't. And again, there's no provision for that whatsoever in policy. We have to apply either a test of exceptional circumstances to all of those sites, or a test of defining the boundary for the first time, which is the position that we believe should be taken. In terms of the council's position, we've then been told that it's a two-step approach, whereby step one was to look at the detailed boundaries and effectively set the boundaries, and then step two is to then amend those boundaries by applying exceptional circumstances. And I've already referenced paragraph 82, but it's clear within there that those two stages are to be done in separate plan processes. The first one talks about establishing in a plan and then altering in exceptional circumstances through a review of a plan. So because we're not reviewing, we shouldn't be looking at the exceptional circumstances test. So in terms of ST14, Mr Carey's point's absolutely relevant to this in terms of paragraph 85, which looks at the strategic aims and says that when we are defining the boundary, we should look at meeting identified requirements for strategic development, for sustainable development, sorry. And yesterday we had the discussion on the strategy, and we had the discussion that identified through the strategy there is a requirement for these sites to take place. So that's been done. So therefore we should be applying the boundaries and defining them to those areas. We should be looking at the boundary for the first time, look at the strategy, look at the council's approach to delivering homes, and then release that land from the, well, sorry, not release, not include it in the green belt when we define it. And that's exactly what paragraph 85 tells us. What paragraph 85 also tells us in the penultimate bullet point is that we should be satisfied that green belt boundaries, when defined, should extend beyond the plan period. But if we take the council's approach of defining them today and amending them tomorrow, let alone the plan period, they won't actually last until tomorrow lunchtime, because we'll set them today and we'll then apply exceptional circumstances to release land from it before we even have an adopted plan. So I think that shows that we are simply setting boundaries, and therefore we need to look at what land is being included. The inner boundary should look at the purposes of Greenbelt, and the outer boundaries in those midpoint areas can simply rely upon meeting sustainable development.
Mrs Jukes.
Thank you, sir. Just to build upon a few things that have been said, in answering your question 3.2, and with reference to paragraph 85 of the NPPF, I do feel that in looking through TP1, the council's focus very much on the elements of paragraph 85 that refer to setting green belt boundaries, but in doing so there's missed an important part of the paragraph that also refers to looking at long-term development opportunities, and that's the part of RSS policy YH9 that I also feel that the council's approach has failed to address, because RSS YH9 paragraph C actually says that there's an expectation that the plan should endure beyond the plan period, and also the NPPF, it states, you know, it should be stretching well beyond the plan period, and in both regards there's an expectation about safeguarding land, but that's something that the policy, that the addendum TP1 doesn't seem to fully address, that need for long-term development and the need to identify and remove land, well, not set greenbelt boundaries that allows for long-term development needs, rather than the council approach, which simply seems to be about setting greenbelt boundaries.
Mr Tucker.
Thank you, sir. Very quickly, just in response to what Ms Sheldon had to say a few moments ago, the suggestion is that the process of the council was to identify what land on the edge of the urban area fulfills greenbelt functions, purposes, forgive me, and if they are identified as doing so, then one applies the exceptional circumstances test. I understand that to be a reference to the exhaustive, forgive me, exercise Annex 3 of the addendum paper, where you've got a little red line which you can follow around and identify where it would be drawn to show where the council would think the boundary should be. So you'll see repeatedly through that exercise in that annex the reference to the words, this boundary has been established for a significant period of time. That's wrong. The establishment of the boundary is this process. So the process of establishment is the point that this plan gets adopted. And that's the point of the trigger in paragraph 83 of NPPF. There is no intermediate trigger of we have assessed land as fulfilling a greenbelt purpose and then assume that it is within the Greenbelt to apply the test within the second sentence of paragraph 83. It's not the way in which the guidance is written, sir, for the reasons that I set out earlier and won't repeat. So I did also say that I referred to the case in relation to the key diagram, the Satnam case, and offered that to be added to the library. Would you want that, sir?
I'd like nothing more than to reread Satnam.
It's a loss of my learned friend, Mr. Manley, who's decided not to turn up, so it's fine.
Yeah, if I could ask that that is added to the examination library, if I can ask that the Satnam case is added to the examination library.
We'll do that. We're familiar with it.
I'll email it to Mr. Linus.
Mr. Grundy.
Thank you, sir. In response to the Council's points about the dotted line on the key diagram for the regional spatial strategy, we say that it's unsafe to reach the conclusion that all the land within that, the land shown as white, is automatically within the general extent of Greenbelt. Mr. Linus also talked about the extent of Greenbelt that needs to be defined in order to protect historic character. Well, we also think that the Council should have gone through paragraph 82 of the MPPF before deciding to define those green fingers as green belt, because bullet point 1 of paragraph 82 tells the Council to demonstrate why normal planning and development management policies would not be adequate.
Mr. Corsia.
A very quick point, sir, just on the attitude of the Secretary of State in the past, which I think the wording hasn't been quite right, sir. I have one of the key Secretary of State decisions in front of me at the present moment, which was for Germany Beck in 9th of May 2007. That's a site, sir, on the edge of the urban area within the outer ring road. And so the paragraph 15 of that decision, which I can put in, or the Council could put in, it says, Secretary of State disagrees with his inspector's conclusion because she does not consider that the lack of a defined boundary is sufficient justification to arbitrarily exclude any site contained within the general extent of the green belt. So there's a clear decision of the Secretary of State that falls within the general extent of the green belt. Until such time the detailed boundaries of the Greenbelt are defined in an adopted local plan, she considers both sites should be treated on the basis that they lay within the Greenbelt. So I think, sir, that is the general attitude of the Secretary of State, has been followed in virtually every decision I know.
Mrs. Worthington.
Thank you, sir. I realise there's a real problem with the fuzzy edge issue. However, we believe that when you're looking at some of the sites that are clearly contained within the general extent of the Greenbelt, you would have to definitely look at exceptional circumstances for those sites. Excuse me. I would also say that neither figure 7 nor figure 3.1 that have been suggested as possible steps that the Council took to defining the bits of Greenbelt that were necessary to retain as Greenbelt should be taken as the Council's position, because the Council's position has clearly changed from when those were produced, even though one was produced after the event that the decision was taken to include land in the Greenbelt. It does suggest that it would have been very helpful if the Council had produced a proper greenbelt assessment showing how different parts of the land within the area were assessed against the 5 main purposes of the greenbelt, notwithstanding that the historic character of York is highlighted as one of the particularly important areas in relation to York. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll hear the council's reply on those points, and then I will move on to question 3.2.
Thank you, sir. Just the final point, Ms Worthington, we say it's probably more a question of methodology that is better suited to a later question. Mr Grundy essentially repeats points that have been made before, and I'm not going to go through why we have not treated the land within the inner, the dotted line as new green belt. We just don't think that the key diagram should be interpreted as strictly as he suggests in that sense. The broad point that was raised by other speakers related to what have been termed as a precautionary approach taken by the council. I mean, we accept that there's nothing in policy which says you apply a precautionary approach. It's more that the approach to take in the particular circumstances of this case, given the policy in the RSS, leaves room for interpretation as to exactly how the policy should be applied. And we say that the approach taken by the council has taken into account the fact that RSS does not say anything now about housing needs being taken into account when defining the boundary. Any text that might have been included within the previous RSS policy was deleted. There's no reference within the retained policy to what you do. Therefore, we say that the two-stage process followed by the council was appropriate in the sense that there's no clear steer, we say, given in the MPPF as to how to deal with circumstances such as this, particularly given the RSS policy. And insofar as the point was raised in the context of ST15 and ST14, I mean, it illustrates the point. I mean, I don't think anyone has seriously disputed that although you're looking at a boundary definition exercise, it should be for the council to demonstrate exceptional circumstances for ST15. But then ST14, I mean, so far as it suggests that is in reality to be treated as a boundary setting exercise, you can see the difficulty, sir. And that's why we say that when you reach as a matter of judgment, bearing in mind the RSS policy and a broad interpretation of MPPF, it is appropriate to apply exceptional circumstances to cases in particular such as those ones. I don't think we said in respect of ST8 that you shouldn't apply the exceptional circumstances test, as Mr Johnson was suggesting. It's a nice try, but I think we better record that the position of the council is that in reality you should more properly treat that as an incursion into what should be regarded as the general extent as a matter of judgment. And we say that justifies applying the exceptional circumstances test. This isn't to be treated as a process whereby we are setting boundaries and then seeking to carry out a review, as Mr Nalkas has suggested. Really, it's just a two-stage approach which ends up with boundaries being defined through the local plan process, which includes allocated sites, whether they be on the edge of the urban area or further out under ST15. So, in summary, sir, we understand the points that have been raised. We understand that there's scope for legitimate debate on this, particularly as regards the urban fringe sites, but we say that it's appropriate to apply the exceptional circumstances test for the reasons that we've given. And ultimately you end up with a boundary as eventually drawn, as shown on the proposals map, which takes into account the other guidance which has to be applied on defining boundaries in any event.
Thank you. Good, thank you. I'm glad we've cleared all of that up. Let us move then to the approach to defining the Greenbelt boundaries. Yeah, I think what I'd like the council to do here is to take me through precisely how the council has set about the task of delineating the boundaries.
Ms. Sheldon to do that, please.
Thank you. As already discussed, TP1 and the TP1 addendum do set out a scoping exercise for which boundaries need to be defined. Section 4 of the TP1 addendum and TP1 set out broad categories and areas to look at to set out this council's strategic approach, which links with our spatial strategy and our approach purposes. And this sets the scope for which boundaries in York still need or require delineation. This is described in a little bit more detail in Section 5 and Section 6 in the case of the other urban areas within the general extent of the Greenbelt and City of York area. The criteria which inform that delineation of the detailed boundaries are set out and have been identified on the basis of considerations of both national guidance, the strategic approach of the core strategy and the MP and the RSS. The detailed boundaries, they've been assessed in the context of what is the built context now. So they've not, a lot of people have said they've been retrospective and they've rolled forward previous. They haven't, we have started completely afresh and looked at the beginning of this plan process, where should these boundaries be based on RSS, the MPPF and the current plan's strategy. In terms of respecting the MPPF guidance on looking at elements that are essential in terms of openness and permanence, we have taken into account the built context of York and its rural environment and landscape in making some of those decisions. Section 5 of the Greenbelt Addendum sets the detailed criteria for assessment. Through criteria 2A, we set out the consideration of local openness relating to protecting the local historic assets and character. This includes consideration for locally important views and panoramas, characteristics set out. Sorry. I'll try again. So, when we're looking at openness, we try and apply that to the 5 purposes of Greenbelt. So, we have the strategic approach, and then we look at the more localised, detailed approach. So, Figure 7 does not define what should or should not be considered Greenbelt at a local boundary level. That is done through that local assessment. The local assessment follows the criteria set out in 5C in the blue boxes. It first looks at openness.
Well, let's if I can just ask you to pause there. You started off by saying a scoping exercise to establish what boundaries need to be defined.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
So the general extent of the boundary as depicted by RSS, as we've established, is quite a fuzzy line. So we needed to determine which areas of the inner boundary require definition and which areas of the outer boundary require definition.
In terms of the inner boundary, is the answer to that not all of it?
Yes. But I guess relating to this point people are raising around should it exclude land within the ring road, or is there a scope to assess the value of the land within that ring road?
Okay, so you established then that for the inner boundary it all needed to be defined in the plan.
We established that the... Oh, sorry, carry on.
For the outer boundary, not all of that will be defined by this plan because some of it is defined in the plans of adjoining authorities. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So having established that, you sat down and worked out what you needed to do in the context of the RSS and the NPPF. So what considerations did those two documents bring you to?
The first point they brought us to was that the most important thing to establish was what boundaries were important in protecting the historic character and setting of York. So in section 5C, section 2A, we then looked at the local level at where those boundaries
So
were.
if you forgive me.
Sorry.
Right, so first and foremost, you say the importance of setting the Greenbelt boundaries, or the most important element to be taken into account in the setting of the Greenbelt boundary, is the need to protect the historic character of the city. Yeah? Why?
Because that was set out by the saved RSS policy. And then when we evaluated the purpose of the Greenbelt for York, we looked at different options and we tested those through the sustainability appraisal and came to the conclusion that that should still be the primary purpose of the York Greenbelt.
And when I look at paragraph 80 of the MPPF, that says that one of the Greenbelt's 5 purposes is to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. And I think what you're saying is that that was the purpose of primary importance in the council's consideration of where the inner boundary should be. Is that right?
It was of primary importance in the inner and the outer boundary. It was not the only purpose considered, but it was the primary purpose.
And sir, for your reference, that aspect of the methodology is set out at the strategic approach is on pages 12 and 13 of the addendum, and its translation into the localised boundary delineation is dealt with at page 31 of the same document. So pages 13 and 14 establish that the council was looking at a first initial level to identify those areas within the green belt where development should not be located, as a first step to then sort of setting the scene, as it were, for the localised definition of boundaries at the local level. And the first strategic step was dealt with on pages 12 to 14, actually, and then confirmation that the importance of protecting the rural setting of York and the historic setting of York as well was taken into account at the localised level, was on page 31, and that's in section 5C. You can see under purpose, under 1, the strategic assessment, it confirms in the table, area protecting the rural setting of York. And then local assessment, stage 2, evidence for desktop and assessment and site visits identified there, but it's under the heading of protecting local historic assets.
Okay. And that brings you to the map that we see in figure 3 of the addendum. Is that right?
No, the map in figure 3 only sets out the outcomes of the 2003 Historic Character and Setting Study, which is SD 107.
Okay.
While that is useful because it shows us areas which we know are established that need to be kept permanently open, it is not the full extent of the historic character and setting areas for York that need to be protected. That is also set out in section 4 in the text accompanying that.
If you can just explain that to me.
So the 2003 study, SD 107, that sets out, was the first attempt we made to understand what historic character and setting could mean for York. It sets out, I think, is it 8 or 6 principal characteristics that include things like the importance of the open approach roads, the importance of the rural setting, the importance of specific village setting. We have updated that as time's gone on and reviewed it, but in 2014, gradually through time, our understanding of the historic environment has evolved. That is why there is additional evidence listed under point 2A on page 31, because these are other localised considerations to historic character and setting. In 2014, there was the publication of the heritage topic paper, which significantly moved forward not only how we understand the historic setting of the city, but also how we can analyse and appraise that. So the heritage topic paper, again, looked at what were the important characteristics that York needed to preserve. In this instance, it only identified 6 primary broad principles, but within those broad principles are many more detailed characteristics. They reconfirm the earlier 2003 SD 107 work. They still agree that it is important to preserve open approach roads, it is important to preserve the rural setting, it is important to preserve village setting, but they go further than that and help us understand more detail about how they can be interpreted and applied. However, the heritage topic paper, not all of the elements in that document are able to be mapped out as land to keep permanently open. So, and not only that, the approach the council has taken is that it wouldn't necessarily be useful to use that document in that way. It would be very restrictive because essentially what that document says is that all the land in York contributes in some way to the historic character and setting of the city. Therefore, in line with that, we've tried to take the principles in that document and apply them through the spatial strategy that says we will seek to conserve and enhance the historic character setting of the city while still accommodating growth. So we've devised a mechanism within that, which has been approved by Historic England, where when land needs to be released, it is assessed through a heritage impact appraisal.
Keep with the boundary setting. Keep with the boundary setting. I think, sir, yes, the point is, I think it's paragraph 4.17 of the topic paper addendum recognises that figure 3 that you've mentioned gives a strategic level assessment of the areas that are important to the special character and setting of York, which sets out the most important areas, but you then have to descend to the local level where you may have other additional considerations which refine the areas that are identified in figure 3 and which need to be taken into account when setting either the inner or the outer boundary. And those factors are taken in, or those factors are set out in the boundary delineation criteria on page 31. So you're moving from a strategic level assessment to a fine-grained assessment. I think that's why Ms Sheldon is saying you can obviously look at figure 3, but it's not the end of the story.
We then do also consider the other purposes of Greenbelt when we move on to 2.2b on page 32. We assess...
Sorry, I'll come to that in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, could you just tell me about, you say you devised a mechanism, this heritage impact appraisal. Can you just explain that to me?
Yes, so a heritage impact appraisal takes parcels of land that are designated for development and assesses them against the criteria set out in the heritage topic paper to identify the level of harm that might be caused to the historic city.
And was that as part of the, to use Mr. Linus's phrase, descent to the lower local level? Is that something that you applied as part of this process, or is that something else?
No, that's something else. We use the principles of the heritage topic paper to inform the decisions on the boundary, but we don't apply a heritage impact appraisal on every parcel of land because it would be too onerous and we'd need to understand the type of development coming forward.
So is that a tool to use at, say, a planning application stage?
Or in selecting sites for release, yes.
Yes, in this case, sir, it was used to align with the site selection process, but there was information in that work which was then taken into account where relevant as part of the boundary setting.
Yes.
So it was used in relation to the, in inverted commas, release of land exercise that you say you went through, but not for the initial boundary setting. Have I got that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's SD 101 as the HIA work, sir, for your note. And it says expressed it's there for the selection of site allocations. But there's information in there when you look through it, which is contextual and would be relevant to some of the boundary setting. But its purpose was not expressly for that, it was for site selection.
Okay, so having undertaken that, you then looked at the other purposes. Is that right?
As part of the boundary setting, 2A was the most important point of consideration, but at the same time we took point 2B, which was to identify the land which serves a countryside function on the urban fringe.
Sorry, 2B, what's that?
So on page 32, as part of the detailed local assessment, the second part of assessing openness in terms of boundaries was to identify which land was important as it was open and served a countryside function on the urban fringe.
Okay, I see. So that's what you call that criteria or step or whatever to be protecting land which is open and serves countryside function on the urban fringe.
Yes.
And how did you go about that assessment?
The assessment was carried out both as a desktop exercise and through site visits, looking at the current built context and landscape context in the areas surrounding York and on the outer boundaries to be defined. It looked at the nature and context of those areas in terms of how built up or how open they were. It looked at their connectivity to the existing urban areas. I've got here. It looks there. Yeah.
Did you use some sort of matrix or something like that?
No, we did, it was purely a visual assessment. It either met the needs or it did not.
So this is the Greenbelt purpose, isn't it, I think? I mean, tell me if I've got this wrong, but this is the purpose of assisting in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment that you're looking at here. Is that right?
We set out in paragraph 5.44 how we think the purposes of openness link to the criteria of openness and permanence then link to the purposes of Greenbelt. So in paragraph 5.44, we have a table which sets out each one of the purposes of Greenbelt and how we've applied that to the openness criteria. So yes, in answer to your question, section 2B is looking at safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. But also preventing unrestricted sprawl of the built-up area.
So are you looking here at the extent to which parcels of land contribute to the purpose of safeguarding the countryside from encroachment?
Yes.
And I see here that you did that through, well, a number of ways. You looked at OS maps, aerial photography, urban characterization study. You looked at landscape character. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay. You looked at open space typology. Mm-hmm. Why open space typology?
I think we explain the detail behind that in somewhere in the paragraphs between paragraphs 5.53 and 5.60. I think it's actually we look at essentially it's looking at the land use and how that land is used. Is it performing a rural function or not? So, for example, school playing fields are a more urbanised land use, whereas semi-natural open space is more congruous with the countryside. So it's to understand the different land uses and whether they were performing a countryside function or essentially formed part of the urban area. I think it's paragraph 5.59 specifically.
Okay.
So I think just as I've sort of been reading through this, if you look at page 31, 32 that you've been taken to, which set out these criteria, one looks under openness criteria, the strategic assessment, first of all, does the boundary mark the edge of broad areas of land identified to be kept permanently open? And that is basically drawing forward the work that took place in section 4 of the same document, where one looked at a strategic level. You've been taken to figure 3.1 already, the historic character and areas plan. That looked at a strategic level, which was then going to influence what you did at the boundaries at the local level. So that's what point 1 is about. And that took into account the purposes of the green belt at that stage at a strategic level. Then under 2, local assessment. The explanation for that appears from pages 37 through to 42, and it was split into openness and permanence. And we're dealing with openness here. And land to keep permanently open is dealt with on page 37. And one can see in the box that Ms Kennedy has referred to that assessment of openness took into account green belt purposes at the local level as set out in that table, including checking unrestricted sprawl and assisting in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. And then pages 38 to 39 explain in more detail how that overall approach has been split into the 2 separate criteria at 2A, protecting local historic assets, and 2B, protecting land which is open and serves a countryside function on the urban fringe. So I think we would say that the localised assessment takes into account the purposes as part of this wider consideration of openness, and then defines those through separate criteria relating to local historic assets and character and land serving a countryside function. So the purposes of the green belts permeate that openness approach at the local level, as explained in those pages. I think that's the overall structure to the approach that's been taken. And permanence is dealt with separately. You can see, sir, that permanence criteria appear on page 33, and then the explanation for permanence is dealt with at pages 40 to 42.
So once an area had been established that needed to be kept permanently open, we then looked for the most permanent and recognisable boundary to support that area. I think we set out in paragraph 5.71 that setting that permanent boundary is important in preventing sprawl and coalescence, as well as protecting the countryside from encroachment and encouraging urban regeneration. So again, permanence criteria we felt related back to the 5 purposes.
Yes, as you might be able to tell, I'm struggling a little bit. What I want to understand, because I think what you're telling me is that you're set the task of delineating the greenbelt boundaries, and you have to come, don't you, to a decision about what land should be in the greenbelt and what land shouldn't be. And to inform that judgment, you look at the extent to which parcels around the, as you call it, I think, urban fringe, do or don't serve, the extent to which those parcels do or don't serve one or more of the 5 greenbelt purposes.
That is correct.
Am I right so far?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the task set, or the task you set about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just struggling ever so slightly. I'm sure it's my fault entirely, but I'm not quite seeing how this does that. Can you hold my hand and guide me gently through?
Mm-hmm.
Well, by which I mean have a second go.
Well, I'll try, sir, and then Ms Sheldon can add to it. I think the process that's been followed is that you accept, first of all, that you've got an inner and outer boundary to define. You know that you have got a spatial strategy running alongside this, which is based on protecting the historic character of York, and that aligns with the approach to setting the inner boundary in particular. So section 4 of the addendum carries out the task of saying what are the purposes of the green belt at a strategic high level that gives you broad areas of land where development should be avoided in a way that allows you to define your localized boundaries, inner and outer, at a localized stage. So section 4 was dealing at a very strategic level with identifying areas within York which contributed to green belt purposes. So, for example, on page 14, purpose 1, check the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas. That was done by reference to an approach which looked at access to services and identified land at a strategic level only where green belt purposes were being served. Figure 3 we've looked at already, dealt with purpose 4, preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. So section 4 was identifying those broad areas in York which met the purposes, which were then to be taken into account at the detailed boundary setting stage, both inner and outer boundaries in later sections of this document. So that was the starting point. Section 5 then went on to ask when one is setting these boundaries, how do we take into, section 5C in particular, how do we take into account the green belt purposes and apply the tests for boundary delineation, in particular looking at openness and permanence criteria. So in section 5C, it identified that there was a need to consider openness in choosing whether or not land fell in or outside the boundary, and it was necessary to consider permanence when considering whether or not to include land in or outside the boundary. And those criteria were set out as headings on pages 31 to 33. When it came to dealing with the question of openness, the approach that was followed was set out in pages 36 through to 39. And what the document does is on page 37, it says, when applying the openness criteria, which is a fundamental aspect of working out whether or not land falls in or outside the boundary, the green belt purposes are relevant to that, and the box on page 37 sets out how those purposes influence the question of whether it's necessary to include land within the green belt, which ought to be kept permanently open. So that's criterion 2. And criterion 2A and 2B provide more detail about how judgments were made about whether or not land should lie in or outside the boundary, applying the question of whether it needed to be kept open. And those pages provide in more detail the refinement of the approach that was taken, and it's summarised in page 32. So that the document is essentially setting out how the Council chose where the boundaries should lie based upon the contribution that that area of land made to the openness of the green belt, and that's then reflected in the very detailed judgments that are set out in Annex 3, where that methodology was applied to individual sections of the boundary going round the inner boundary. So if you look through Annex 3, the methodology that was set out in Section 5C was followed for discrete parts of the boundary. So the Council asked, when looking at openness at a local level and permanency at a local level, should land be included or excluded, and where the boundary should therefore lie. And that dealt with the methodology that's been set out in Section 5C. And it went through the same process looking at the criterion of permanence, which is drawn from the NPPF as well. And the permanence criteria is explained at pages 41 to 42, and then applied by reference to detailed elements of land around the boundary in Annex 3 for the inner boundary. So I think you need to look at Annex 3 as well, sir, because it's clear when you look at that these judgments have been applied, walking round the boundary, applied to particular parcels of land, following the methodology that's been identified, and the judgments are set out and then in Annex 3.
Conceptually, there's nothing like a question that starts with the word conceptually. Has the Council overlain the notions of openness and permanence, sort of overlaying that across the 5 purposes? Is that a correct characterisation?
I wouldn't say overlaying. I think the point that's been taken is they have set out 2 fundamental criteria, openness and permanence. But they've recognised that when considering the question of openness, the purposes are relevant to the judgments that are made on openness. And that's illustrated by page 37. So the fundamental question that's been asked is it necessary to keep land permanently open? In working out how exactly you answer that question, there are a range of matters to take into account, which are set out in pages 38 to 40, as well as in the box at page 32. But the approach taken recognised that the 5 purposes must feed into that broad question in some way, and that's the purpose of the table on page 37. So the fundamental question as you walk around the boundary is it necessary to keep this land permanently open? But it was recognised that the purposes were relevant to that overall judgment. So I think it's not quite accurate to say overlaying. I think the fundamental question that was asked was, is it necessary to keep the land permanently open? But the Council felt it couldn't simply ignore the purposes when reaching a judgment on that.
So then, have you started with the fundamental principles of openness and permanence?
Yes.
Gone around where the boundaries might be, assessed the land in relation to those 2 things, and in so doing, asked yourself the question, well, is it necessary for openness for the purpose of checking unrestricted sprawl, preventing neighbouring towns merging, safeguarding the countryside, etc., to have a permanent boundary right here? Is that it in a nutshell?
I would say so, yes.
Hurrah. And the detailed outcome of that work is, did you say it was in the appendix, Mr. Linus?
3, which are the series of judgments based on the inner boundary, and I think Annex 4 is the outer boundary is, sorry, the outer boundary is Annex 2, the inner boundary is Annex 3. And when you look through Annex 3, that's been split up into boundary sections, and essentially those annexes walk round the boundary and apply the openness and permanence criteria that I've referred you to.
And in terms of both the inner and outer boundaries, how did the key diagram in the RSS play into all of that?
I think so it goes back to the debate that was had before the break. The key diagram was recognised as far as inner boundary was concerned in telling the council it needed to set the inner boundary, but it didn't provide, beyond identifying that we thought that was land within the general extent of the green belt, it didn't provide enough detail to assist with the detailed boundary setting at the local level. And as far as the outer boundary was concerned...
Sorry, just
sorry, sorry, sir.
What we interpreted from the RSS key diagram in terms of the inner boundary is that when we were talking before about the dotted line, we can't be sure as to what that implied, but we can see that there is a definite urban area in the centre of that. So we interpreted that to mean that the built-up urban area of York was not part of the general extent, and we needed to define what the edge of that was.
So does that mean in terms of the inner boundary then, you set about looking at open land immediately adjacent to the, in inverted commas, urban fringe, or the built edge, however you want to couch it, of the city? And at that stage, did you or didn't you have in mind the local plan's development needs? I think the answer is no, because you're telling me that you've taken, in effect, a two-stage approach.
We reviewed the boundaries to identify what land did not need to be kept permanently open. In some instances, we did identify land where it didn't need to be kept permanently open, and therefore there was room for development, such as at ST2 and at ST4. What we didn't want to do is identify land without understanding the potential harm that land could have on the historic character and setting of York.
I think you're talking about a slightly different process there, though, aren't you? You undertook a separate process in relation to the selection of sites. We're on the question of boundary setting at the moment.
That's correct. We didn't take into account need.
And in relation to the outer boundary, if we move to the outer boundary now, how did RSS guide you in that respect?
We obviously had regard to the key diagram in that it is a belt of land around York, but we again took the wording of the policy in that we needed to establish the extent to which the land is necessary to protect the historic character and setting of the city, and also regards to MPPF as to the purposes that land fulfills.
My apologies, I didn't quite catch all of that. You said that you needed to establish whether it needs to be kept permanently open in relation to the setting of the city, and then you said something else I didn't catch.
And then
Was it something about the other purposes?
Yeah, and also with regard to the other 5 purposes as set out in section 4 in the strategic approach, which sets the scope.
I'm sorry, but there are 1 or 2 people around the table that are really rubbish at whispering, and it's just catching my ear and distracting my chain of thought. And the question of the 6 miles.
We didn't see 6 miles as prescriptive, only in that it established the broad sphere of influence for the city of York. When we reviewed the boundaries that have already been determined, they don't follow a rigid circular line. When we look at applying that to York, obviously we would never have a hard curved edge. We would establish the boundaries. And when we looked at the difference between the value of the land on one side and the other of the 6 miles, there was little difference in terms of the contribution. We felt the land up to the boundaries still contributed towards the historic character and setting of York. Again, some of that was informed through our understanding.
So when you say the boundary there, are you talking about the authority boundary?
The authority boundary, yeah. When we look at the heritage topic paper, it says it's not only the main urban area of York which is important, but its countryside setting and the satellite villages around it, and the setting of those villages, as I think we say in section 4 under historic character and setting, about nested historic assets and their settings.
So when you were looking then at RSS policy and considering the question of general conformity with it, and you saw that policy Y1C says that you should define the detailed boundaries of the outstanding sections of the outer boundary of the York Green Belt about 6 miles from York city centre. You thought that, well, what? That didn't matter. You could go to 8 or more.
No, we assessed that in asking us to establish the boundaries approximately 6 miles, it was saying that it had not identified the extent of the area which supported the historic character and setting of York, and that was for us to do. Does that make sense?
No, I don't follow.
I think so. The point I've made before is that the reference to about 6 miles gives flexibility, and there had been previous appeal decisions where, as we've recorded, land further away than 6 miles had been regarded as being within the general extent of the green belt. So there's flexibility in terms of what about 6 miles means, and if you're then moving on from that, you have general conformity with the RSS. So there is scope for flexibility in how you apply that. It's not that you ignore the 6 miles, but you use that as a starting point for working out where you think you need to draw your boundary. And when assessing where you do draw the boundary, you then have to consider the green belt purposes. And if those take you beyond a strict approach to 6 miles, then it's justified in drawing the boundary accordingly. So about 6 miles gives flexibility, but you would overlay onto that, if I can use that term, and need to assess the land according to the purposes of the green belt, including the historic character of York. And if that assessment justified moving beyond 6 miles, then it was entirely appropriate to draw the boundary accordingly.
Just as a matter of fact, parts of the outer boundary that are defined in neighbouring authority areas, are those further than 6 miles from York city centre?
They must be. Just bear with me. Yes, I'm told that. Which authority is that, Selby?
No, that's. Give me a second.
So we're just checking, sir, on the maps.
Where does it go furthest?
Yes, sir. If you look at the plans on pages 23 and following in the TP1 addendum, they show where the green belt extends into other areas, including Hambleton, Harrogate on page 24, Rydale on page 25, and Selby on page 26. And I understand, Ms. Sheldon can confirm, that when you look at those extents of green belt, all of those go beyond 6 miles.
For the avoidance of any doubt, those are areas of green belts that are set in development plan documents that are adopted.
Yes, that's right. That's right, sir.
What about East Riding? So there's that green belt in East Riding. So, given that, well, what? I mean, what did that put in your mind? I mean, was there then any sense at all in the question of sort of looking at what 6 miles from the city centre might lead to?
Yes, we have looked at what 6 miles from the city centre might lead to. It isolates the village of Weldrake outside of the green belt. We think the village of Weldrake is part of the settlements and the historic development of the city of York, and excludes other features that we think are important to York.
So I think the point is, to answer your question, yeah, there were already areas of green belt which extended, if you took the measurement from the centre of York, to beyond 6 miles, and that reinforced the view that it would be not necessarily a barrier at 6 miles, because other authorities had green belts within them that went beyond the 6 mile distance.
When I look at those maps, I note that each one of them says York Green Belt. That is what I'm looking at, is it? So it's not, in the case of Harrogate, a tract of green belt that is there for the purpose of protecting land around Harrogate, and the same in relation to Selby, etc. It is York Green Belt.
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, I don't wish to be seen to be second guessing what you might have thought, but did you think that, frankly, it would be unrealistic to set a boundary that followed the 6 mile reference in RSS policy, given the present situation in relation to adjoining adopted development plans?
So I think yes, in part, but it wasn't simply about the fact that other authorities had areas of York Green Belt which went beyond the 6 miles. As we said, there was the interpretation of the RSS policy in its own right, which was flexible, and the recognition within the authority that with that flexibility, one should look to assess the purposes or the extent to which land, even outside the 6 mile 6 mile distance, contributed to green belt purposes. So you had to do that in areas which didn't adjoin local authority areas which had green belt in them, but you were certainly assisted by the fact that other authorities went beyond the 6 mile limit. But there was a separate exercise which said, we think we've got flexibility. We need to look at these areas in terms of the extent to which they fulfil green belt functions, and that in its own right was a reason not to fix it 6 mile at a 6 mile distance. The fact that the green belt went beyond 6 mile and other authorities corroborated that position.
Well, I mean, look, I'm looking at figure 9 on page 24 just as an example. We have the area of York Green Belt that is in Harrogate, and I use this just as an illustrative example. I don't actually know what else is going on in Harrogate there, because this plan doesn't show me, so I don't know if there is Harrogate Green Belt beyond the York Green Belt. There is there? Right, okay. But if you were then, I mean, I also don't know whether that's 6 miles or more or less, but it matters not for the concept. If you were to draw a line that was 6 miles, say around here somewhere like that, if we say if it were there, that would leave, would it, a strip of green belt for York purposes that was isolated away from the rest of the York Green Belt that you had defined in your plan, which would be daft.
Yes.
I think we make the point in the scoping exercise that one of the important considerations was to join up the already established green belt in other areas.
And one might guess that there might be some sort of duty to cooperate issue there, would there?
Was that discussed as part of the duty to cooperate? Potentially, sir, yes. Yes. Sorry. Okay, I didn't know where it came from. So I'm told Mr. Wright helpfully says that he's drawn a plan with a 6 mile radius from the centre of York in his hearing statement, which shows the relationship between 6 miles and the local authority extensive green belt.
Yeah, I have seen that, and it's somewhere here amongst all the
Yes.
papers that I have on my desk in my Paperlight examination. Sorry, did you answer my last question? Do you remember what it was?
No, could you repeat it?
Which was, well, you know, would there have been the potential for that to have given rise to duty to cooperate issues? The notion or one or the other adjoining local authorities having in its adopted plan Greenbelt for the purpose of protecting York, safeguarding land around York.
Yes, to some extent, sir. I mean, the sense that that green belt had already been established. There wasn't anything in terms of green belt which was going to sort of cross over from York into Harrogate, by way of example, that required cross-working in that sense, because the green belt had already been defined within Harrogate. It was really for York to do that work within its own boundary area. But green belt issues were raised through the duty to cooperate discussions, and it's identified in the duty to cooperate statement that we looked at on the first day. And there certainly weren't any outstanding issues raised by other parties with regard to the approach that was being taken by York to the setting of green belt boundaries within its own area.
You said that you did consider looking at the 6 mile question. In so doing, what did you take to be York City Centre?
We took it as St Sampson Square. St Sampson Square.
Sorry, where?
St Sampson Square. It's at the end of Parliament Street in the city centre. I think is it listed in the RSS policy? No?
Well, no, the RSS policy says about 6 miles from York City Centre, so I wonder what you've taken to be York City Centre.
Using St Sampson Square is consistent with recent appeal decisions. Inspectors' reports.
I assume that during those appeals that the council put forward some sort of reasoning for why St Sampson Square was taken to be the centre of the city. I'm second guessing that none of my colleagues just made it up.
Fair, I think it must be a fair assumption, sir, that would have been explained by the council. The evidence that was placed before those appeals, we don't obviously have, but I'm assuming that it must have been something that's explained by the council as informing the approach that it took in those cases. We can look into that to locate the precise source of that, where that spot was taken from, sir, if that would help.
Yeah, well, look, you know, for my part, irrespective of what justification was given or not at various appeals, what I'm interested in is what justification the council relies on in relation to the evidence base here. So if you would, a small item of homework. Okay, I'm going to halt proceedings there and take a much-needed lunch break. It is now 11 minutes past 1. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 2 o'clock. Thank you.